A text arrives at 11 at night. It says, "If you really loved me, you'd understand why I said that." Your stomach tightens immediately. You start typing out a careful apology for something you're still not entirely sure you did. That familiar fog sitting in your chest actually has a name, but the real answer behind it is far stranger than one bad relationship, one difficult coworker, or one persuasive stranger. Manipulation isn't a personality trait. It isn't charisma turned towards something dark or a con artist's smooth patter. It's a set of mechanical shortcuts wired directly into how your brain decides what to trust, built from decades of documented research and used daily by people who never had to invent a single one of them themselves. Some inherited the tactics from a parent who used them first. Some absorbed them from a workplace that rewarded the results without ever naming the method. Very few sat down and designed a strategy from scratch because they never needed to. The shortcuts were already sitting there, waiting to be used by anyone willing to apply them consistently. Learn how those shortcuts work, and you begin seeing the machinery running underneath conversations that once left you doubting your own memory. Psychologist Robert Cialdini spent years studying this machinery from the inside, not in a lab coat behind a one way mirror, but on the floor of used car lots, inside sales training seminars, behind the scripts handed to door charity workers. He wanted to understand why intelligent, cautious people kept saying yes to requests they would have refused if asked outright. What he documented became one of the most cited frameworks in behavioral science. 6 triggers that hijack a decision before conscious thought even shows up to weigh in: reciprocity, commitment, social proof, authority, liking, scarcity. Reciprocity is the itch to repay a favor, even one you never asked for. A free sample at a grocery store, a small compliment before a big ask, or a tiny unrequested kindness offered moments before someone requests something far larger in return. Your brain treats debt, even emotional debt, as something that must be settled quickly. Manipulators rarely need to calculate this consciously. They only need to know it works and repeat it. Commitment operates on a different lever entirely. Once you say yes to something small, your sense of self quietly rearranges around that yes. Researchers Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser demonstrated this in 1966 with an unusual door to door experiment in California. Homeowners who agreed to display a small "Be a Safe Driver" card in their window were, weeks later, far more likely to agree to plant an enormous, unattractive billboard on their front lawn for the same cause. Nothing about the second request was appealing on its own, but the small yes had already rewritten how those homeowners saw themselves. Why does a single minor agreement carry so much weight? Because consistency feels like integrity, even when the first domino was placed there by someone else entirely. Then there's authority, the shortcut your brain reaches for the instant it registers a uniform, a title, or an unwavering tone of certainty. Stanley Milgram pushed this shortcut to its limit in 1961 at Yale University. Ordinary volunteers were instructed to deliver what they believed were increasingly severe electric shocks to another person, solely because a man in a lab coat calmly insisted the experiment required it. Most of them kept going, well past the point where the other person appeared to be in serious distress, not because they were cruel by nature, because the presence of authority had quietly switched off their own moral calculus and outsourced it to someone else in the room. That switch didn't disappear when the experiment ended in 1963. It's still installed in your brain today, activating every time a doctor, a manager, or a confident stranger states something as fact. Social proof works alongside authority, though it borrows its power from the crowd instead of the individual. Solomon Asch demonstrated this back in 1951, asking volunteers to judge the length of simple lines on a card while seated among actors instructed to give obviously wrong answers out loud. Roughly a third of real participants abandoned the evidence directly in front of their own eyes and agreed with the group instead. Nothing was threatened, no one was punished for disagreeing. The mere presence of consensus was enough to bend perception. Scroll through any comment section today, and that same pressure is doing quiet, constant work. Liking adds one more layer underneath all of it. No, psychologist Karen Dion's research on the halo effect in the early 1970s found that people rate physically attractive strangers as more trustworthy, more intelligent, and more moral, with no actual evidence to support any of those assumptions. A warm smile, a shared hobby, a compliment that lands at exactly the right moment, none of it proves good character, but your brain treats likability as a shortcut for it anyway, which is precisely why so many manipulators lead with charm instead of argument. Charm doesn't need to win a debate, it only needs to lower your guard before the debate starts. Scarcity closes the set, and it may be the fastest trigger of all six. Psychologist Stephen Warshell ran a now famous experiment in 1975 involving two identical jars of cookies, one nearly full, one nearly empty. Participants consistently rated the cookies from the almost empty jar as tastier, even though the cookies themselves were exactly the same. Limited availability didn't just change preference, it changed perceived value on a sensory level. A countdown clock, age or only three left, a relationship that might end at any moment if you don't comply, all of it borrows the same jar. The part almost nobody expects walking into this topic is this: the people most susceptible to manipulation aren't gullible and they aren't weak willed. Often they're the most empathetic people in the room, the ones who take relationships seriously, who assume good faith, who feel genuine discomfort at the idea of disappointing someone. Manipulation rarely targets stupidity, it targets trust, the exact trait most people spend their whole lives being taught to protect and grow. That's part of what makes coercive relationships so disorienting from the inside and so hard to explain to anyone standing outside them. In the 1950s, sociologist Albert Biderman studied American prisoners of war returning from Korea, trying to understand how captors dismantled a person's grip on reality without needing to lay a hand on them. He mapped the process into what's now called Biderman's chart of coercion: isolate the person from outside support, monopolize their perception until your voice becomes the loudest one left in the room, induce exhaustion and steady self doubt, alternate cruelty with small, unpredictable kindnesses so the relief itself becomes something to crave, threaten just enough to maintain compliance without ever fully explaining why the threat exists. One detail on that list explains more than the rest combined: the alternating pattern of cruelty and kindness. B.F. Skinner's research on operant conditioning, conducted decades before Bitterman published his chart, found that rewards delivered on an unpredictable schedule produce far stronger, far more persistent behavior than rewards delivered every single time. Pigeons pecking a lever for food kept pecking longest not when food appeared reliably, but when it appeared unpredictably on a variable schedule with no fixed pattern to learn. Swap the pigeon for a person and the lever for a relationship, and the mechanism holds. Unpredictable affection, apology, or warmth doesn't just soothe the previous harm. It trains the nervous system to keep reaching for the next reward, the same way a slot machine keeps someone pulling a handle long after the odds have made themselves obvious. Read that list slowly a second time, and something unsettling comes into focus. It doesn't only describe prison camps decades ago. Therapists now recognize this exact pattern inside emotionally abusive relationships, inside high control workplaces, and inside certain online communities built almost entirely around isolating members from outside perspective. The mechanism transferred intact across 70 years because the mechanism was never really about war in the first place. It was about cutting a person off from every version of reality except the one being handed to them on schedule. There's a fourth researcher worth naming here because her work targets manipulation directly rather than persuasion in general. Psychologist Jennifer Freed coined the term Darvo in the 1990s to describe a pattern she observed again and again in cases of interpersonal abuse. Deny the behavior happened, attack the credibility of the person raising it, reverse the roles of victim and offender, So the person who brought up the harm ends up apologizing for bringing it up at all. Freed's research found this pattern so consistent across unrelated cases that it functions almost like a script, even when the people using it have never read a word of her research. You may already recognize it. The accusation gets met not with an answer, but with a counter accusation, delivered with just enough confidence that you start defending yourself instead of the point you originally raised. So, why does any of this still work on smart, self aware people living in the present, people who have almost certainly read an article about manipulation tactics before? Because none of these tactics require a criminal mastermind running a hidden plan. They require nothing more than repetition and proximity. A manipulator rarely needs a strategy session. They only need enough regular contact with you to apply pressure in doses small enough that no single moment feels alarming, enough to name out loud. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman's research on fast automatic thinking versus slow, deliberate thinking helps explain the gap. Your brain runs on the fast system by default, the one built for speed rather than accuracy, and every tactic above is engineered to exploit exactly that system before the slower, more careful one has time to switch on. Consider how naturally all of this maps onto a feed you scroll through every single day. Reciprocity shows up as free content, free trials, endless value offered generously before any ask arrives. Commitment shows up as the small follow, the tiny like, the single comment that quietly nudges you toward identifying as part of a group you never consciously chose to join. Authority shows up as a blue check mark, a studio backdrop, a confident tone that borrows credibility it hasn't actually earned. Liking shows up as relatability, a creator who shares just enough of themselves that you begin to feel you know them personally long before they ask you to buy something. Scarcity shows up as a countdown timer on a sale that quietly resets the moment you refresh the page. None of it requires a villain behind a curtain. It only requires a system built by people who read the same research everyone else could have read and simply used it first, at scale, before you had a name for what was happening to you. Workplaces run their own version of this same architecture, often without anyone involved consciously designing it. A manager who praises you extravagantly in front of the team, then quietly asks you to absorb another person's workload the same afternoon, is running reciprocity and authority in the same 60 seconds. A company culture that frames leaving as disloyalty, that treats questioning a decision as not being a team player, is running Biderman's isolation and monopolized perception with better branding and a logo on the wall. None of it requires a single person to sit down and plan it maliciously. It only requires a system where these shortcuts happen to work, and nobody with the power to change it has a reason to look closely. Isolation, the sharpest tool on Biederman's entire list, has a modern shape too, and it rarely looks like a locked room anymore. It looks like a recommendation algorithm quietly narrowing the range of opinions you're shown day after day until the loudest voice you hear belongs to someone who has never met you and has no reason to care whether what they're telling you is even true. It looks like a partner who frames every friend and family member as somehow against the relationship, one relationship at a time, until the only remaining reference point for reality is the person doing the framing. Notice too how manipulation almost never announces itself directly. It doesn't say, I am about to change how you see yourself. It says, if you really loved me. It says, everyone else already agreed. So why are you the only holdout? It says, trust me, I know exactly what I'm doing here. Each phrase quietly borrows one of Cialdini's 6 triggers, dressed in the intimate language of a single relationship instead of a boardroom pitch. Love bombing, the well documented pattern of overwhelming someone with affection and attention early in a relationship, is really just reciprocity and liking stacked together and delivered at maximum intensity all at once before the other person has any evidence to weigh it against. Picture the exact moment Darvo shows up in an ordinary sentence. You bring up something that hurt you. The reply isn't an apology, it's a question about why you're always keeping score, followed by a reminder of something you did wrong months ago, delivered with more emotion than the original issue ever got. Within 30 seconds, you're the one explaining yourself. Freed's research suggests this isn't improvisation. It's a pattern reliable enough to predict, which means it's also a pattern reliable enough to notice once you know its shape. What actually separates ordinary persuasion from something closer to control isn't the tactic itself. Everyone uses reciprocity sometimes, everyone leans on authority occasionally. The real dividing line is repetition without an exit. One person invoking authority once in one conversation is simply persuasion, the same kind used in a job interview or a doctor's office. The same person doing it daily while slowly narrowing who else you're allowed to talk to about it is something else entirely. The individual tactics look identical in both cases. What changes is whether you still have somewhere else left to check your own reality against. The outside reference point, the friend who says something feels off, the version of yourself from a year ago who wouldn't have accepted this, is precisely what these tactics are built to remove first, which is worth sitting with the next time a pattern in your life starts feeling less like a string of arguments and more like a fog you can't quite name out loud, even to yourself. None of this means every compliment is a trap, or every deadline is a scarcity tactic in disguise, or every apology is secretly Darvo wearing a friendlier mask. Most persuasion in daily life is completely ordinary, harmless, even necessary. A friend asking a favor, a boss setting a real deadline, a partner apologizing because they actually mean it. The goal was never to treat every interaction like a threat. It was to give the fog a shape so that when the pattern does repeat, when the isolation and the unpredictable warmth center in the reverse blame start showing up together instead of alone, you have language for it instead of only a feeling you can't quite justify out loud. A named pattern is something you can hold up next to your own experience and compare. An unnamed feeling is just something you carry. Recognizing that fog forming, catching the exact moment a shortcut is being pulled instead of simply feeling confused by it, is exactly the kind of noticing this channel exists to keep sparking, and the mechanism sitting underneath manipulation is exactly the kind of thread future videos keep pulling on, one hidden pattern at a time. A text arrives late at night. It says something that makes your stomach tighten again. This time you pause before you reach for the phone. You notice the shortcut being pulled instead of only feeling the fog roll in. And that noticing, quiet and small as it is, turns out to be the real answer. Far stranger and far more useful than any apology you were about to type.